Hello. I talk about politics on this channel. This one's going to be a little controversial. See, occasionally I talk about these people who call themselves libertarians, although I'd think of a different name that I think all of them share. I want to start out, I suppose, by sort of explaining the capitalist faith. And by capitalist, I don't necessarily just mean American libertarian, I'd mean anarcho-capitalist, American libertarian, conservative, basically everything. All those things, not counting libertarian socialists, I'm lumping them all into one group and calling them capitalist. Because the thing is that's effectively what they are. They are all in favor of capitalism to some extent. What I think is a little dishonest is the framing of the libertarian debate, the capitalist debate, because it's always framed in this way that's like, prove that we need a government, prove that government is a good thing, make the case for government. They always challenge us, like, do this thing. The reason I say that's unfair is because the government's really not their whole ideology. It's one tiny part of what they believe. From my perspective, I don't even view them as an anti-government group. Anyone can be an anti-government group. I view them as a pro-capitalist movement. Because at the end of the day, that's what they are. You know, the libertarian part of libertarianism doesn't mean a damn thing. It's almost like it's like a weird term somebody concocted to make this seem like a more compassionate ideology than it really is. Which is a little dishonest. But yeah, it's capitalism worship. That's the end of the day, that's what it is. To one extent or another, it's the worship of capitalism. I'm not saying right off the bat whether that's good or bad. Science is the worship of the scientific method, whatever. But it is, in fact, capitalism worship. You cannot deny that it's not. I think if you asked any of these people, do you support capitalism? Are you in favor of it? They would all say, yes, of course I do. But I'm a libertarian. Doesn't matter. You know, that's the tiny part of it. The capitalism part of it is what worries me. Because every time in a debate, I'll get challenged, somebody will say, look, prove that government is good. Prove to me, the burden of proof is on you. Prove that we need a government to exist or whatever. Something it's framed in that way. And it's like, why don't you prove that capitalism is good? Why am I the one who's proving something here? Right? Both the government and capitalism, to an extent, exist already. So, as far as proof goes, is proving one thing is you just as much have to make the case that capitalism is somehow a good thing. Now, I'm not so much troubled by the anti-government part of capitalists, the capitalist worship, as much as I'm troubled by the capitalist part of the capitalist ideology. Because I would even classify myself as an anti-capitalist to an extent. But yeah, it is most certainly a faith in capitalism. And it rests on several pillars. And this faith really, it's demonstrated by this very framing of the question. Prove to me, the burden of proof is on you to prove that we need a government. Like, the assumption is that we somehow don't. By default, we just have capitalism and it works. And then the government is this thing that we have the option to have or not. And therefore, the statist's job is to prove that we need that. So, it's like they're taking the more default position that an atheist might take in a discussion with a religious individual and claim the same thing. The burden of proof is on you, my dear theist. You must prove to me that there is evidence for God. I'm assuming that there's not. And to make the analogy with the theism thing more elaborate, I'm going to tell a little story. I'm going to segue for just a second and talk a little bit about two people from the Middle Ages called Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas. Now, if you know anything about sort of medieval philosophy, you definitely know who these two people are. They're both Christians, they're both scholars, they both were obsessed with the philosophical question of whether or not there was a God. Anselm of Canterbury constructed an argument, an ontological argument for the existence of God. It was basically a bunch of what he tried to do is he tried to write, on paper, a bunch of irrefutable, factual claims about reality, and by just deductive logic show that it led to God existing. Thomas Aquinas was a saint who, he believed that the existence of God was something that was self-evident. He didn't think it needed to be proven. And this is an interesting point, because it is effectively... Thomas Aquinas didn't actually agree with Anselm about his argument for the existence of God. Anselm tried very hard to prove it. He tried to construct the whole thing. It was wrong. I mean, I would say the argument was wrong. But Aquinas also said it was wrong. But he still believed in God. And his justification for it was simply that the existence of God is self-evident. Like, how can God not exist? How can it be true that there is no such thing? Now, for the record, I'm just going to point out that I don't actually care about whether or not God exists. That's not what this thing is about. I am just using the theist-atheist debate as an analogy for the debate that I'm having with the capitalists. So Anselm had this faith. He just had this assumption. He couldn't imagine what a world would be like if there was no God. He couldn't believe in that type of thing. He had no idea how someone could think like that, which is really weird, because if you look at society today, it's not so hard to find an atheist. It's not so hard to find a person who doesn't believe in God. And yet, ironically, there's people who talk about how it's all nature, and nurture plays no role in society. It's like, no effective role. And yet, we have this particular example. If Thomas Aquinas had grown up in a different environment, presumably he would not have become a Christian, necessarily. Presumably he might not have become a theist to the extent that he did. Right? It's not that this person was illogical. It's not that he was an idiot. He was a smart guy. He was a scholar. And yet he could not creatively put himself in the mindset of someone who did not believe that God existed. It just felt like such a natural part of reality, right? That right there is nurture. And that right there is exactly the perspective of the capitalist. It is precisely how their faith works. Because they too have this assumption without which they cannot imagine reality. And it is with their assumption that they're posing the question, why do we need a government? And it is from this entire framing of the issue that they come up to a statist and say, make the case for government. And what I'm trying to say is that this very framing is indicative of a bias, one, and number two, this very framing is what needs to be discussed within the discussion. Because that's not what actually happens. I see libertarians and I see capitalists argue with statists, and it's always, hey, well, make the case for government. And it's like, well, government's fine or whatever. And it just always stays on this superficial surface level. It's not talking about what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is the framing of the question already indicates a sort of a difference in conclusions that the two parties have. Because the capitalist must necessarily make assumptions and view things from a certain perspective if their first question going into the discussion is, prove to me that we need a government. Right? Because what that indicates is that they have already made up their minds that we don't need a government. That it's possible for a person to think without needing a government. And they have this faith, which comes from the faith in property rights or the faith in, the market and how the market works. And it's from that framework that they're setting up this question. So what you have to do is you have to be aware of this. Right? You have to be aware that you're not just dealing with the case for government, you're dealing with the framework, right? And what the framework means is that I have a framework as well, obviously, and the statists have a framework. Well, what the point is that going into this discussion, it is not true that it is not simply a matter of government, it is a matter of one framework versus another. Just like in the theist and atheist example, you have two different frameworks. You have a framework that starts off with scientific claims about reality and evidence and the scientific method and the skepticism thereof. And you have a framework that starts off with, the evidence you have from religious texts and religious people and culture and all that stuff, which is still evidence, by the way. I would still count that as evidence. That's still something. That's not nothing. It's not, perhaps it's not as good as the evidence, the scientific evidence or whatever. Perhaps it's not legitimate, but that's a different point. The point is it's still, it's not net zero. But the point is, when these two views clash, they're not just talking about the existence of God, they're talking about something more fundamental than that, which is which faith is better, the faith in the scientific method or the faith in the religious text and the culture. It's both of these faiths coming together and competing within the discussion. But the discussion is never actually about the faiths, it's about the God, it's about the actual issue. Let me just close this. And that itself is a problem. For the discussion to actually get anywhere, you have to go deeper and discuss the faiths themselves. You have to go deeper and talk about what starting assumptions both groups are actually making in order for their viewpoint to come across, right? It's the same thing in this whole thing with the capitalist and the libertarian versus the statists. They're starting from these assumptions about the market, and with those assumptions, their conclusion is perfectly valid, right? I don't believe for a second that they started with the correct assumptions, but somehow ended up in the wrong place. That's not possible as far as I'm concerned, right? In fact, anytime you have two people disagreeing, I don't believe that it's ever the case that they both start in the same place and somehow one of them makes a logical mistake and ends up somewhere else. That's almost never how it happens. In fact, I would bet money that that's never how it happens. How it actually happens is that they don't start in the same place, even though maybe they think they do superficially. But you have to sort of dig deeper to find out if they actually start from the same place. But, I mean, I don't know. Habit would tell me that they don't actually ever start in the same place, which makes it so that they're not just discussing the issue, they're discussing each other's faiths. And in this particular case, with the capitalist, it is the faith in the market and the faith in property rights versus any alternative faith that is against the market and against property rights. And those are the faiths that I subscribe to. Now, granted, I tend to be an equalist, and I would say that the burden of proof is always on both parties in a discussion like this. Both parties have to make the case, not only for their main point, but for their faith in general, for the standard of reasoning that they're using, for their starting assumption. You know, I have to be making the point that I am for science and against religion, or for religion and against science, and or that I am for anti-capitalism and, against anti-government, or that I am for anti-government and for capitalism. Both parties must simultaneously be making the case for both their position and their faith, and so the burden of proof is on both parties. However, if I had to pick one party on whom the burden of proof necessarily had to lie, I would say that it was the capitalist, because as far as I'm concerned, the capitalist is the one that's making the more extraordinary claim. Because they're not just making an extraordinary claim about how the world is, they're making a claim about how the world should be, right? Based on, again, assumptions and theories and all this stuff. That is much more extraordinary than saying that I'm uncertain, or that I don't know, or that there's uncertainty, we can't know for sure, or that we don't necessarily know if this is the right direction. Those are wiser, sort of more safer claims. It's very safe to say, I don't know. It's not safe to say, I know for sure we must establish capitalism. So they're making the more extraordinary claim. Their claim, hence, must require more evidence. So the burden of proof is effectively on them. That is what it would seem like to me. Although my standard is generally both parties have to prove their part or somehow agree on the assumptions. Now that said, this preliminary explanation that it is, in fact, one faith versus another, let's talk a little bit about this faith, the capitalist faith. Because the faith effectively has two pillars. And I'm going to just explain why this faith is stupid and why there's better faiths. Why my alternative faith is better. Frankly, this faith is just completely at odds with logic and science and common sense amongst those things. But common sense is not necessarily, at least the common sense I'm talking about, is not actually against science. The two pillars of the faith are the property rights axioms and the non-aggression principle, which you will see amongst American libertarians and anarcho-capitalists, and it's this deontological basis for libertarian morality. And the second pillar is the faith in the market as some kind of natural and efficient and effective way at allocating social welfare and determining what's best for everybody. Those are the two faiths. Those are the two pillars of their faith. They're interconnected. They're not completely separate, but they're pretty distinct. I spent a lot of time on YouTube debating that first one, the property rights thing. I have spent a lot of time explaining why that isn't good, why it's just arbitrary and pointless and it contradicts itself. I can go into a little bit more detail about that now, actually. So, the property rights NAP faith and the non-aggression principle. It's a deontological framing of morality, and it's effectively saying that there's just this rule that you don't aggress against other people, and you don't violate their property rights, and that's just the rule, and you follow that rule, and it yields, whatever. And it's just, you have to follow this rule. So it's different from a consequentialist view of libertarian theory, where you think that we need to establish a free market because a free market is what's best for everybody. No, this is more than that. This is saying we don't have to worry about consequences. There's just a principle. Now, I just think in general, deontological framings are faulty, and there's a whole bunch of ways that this thing falls apart. But I'm just going to explain one. For their thing to make sense, they necessarily must define a define distinctly the consequences of one person's actions and the consequences of another person's actions. Why they need to do this? Because if the consequences of your actions end up aggressing against somebody else, then if you end up aggressing against somebody else, and those are the consequences of your actions, violate the non-aggression principle against other people, you are at fault, you are liable, so on and so forth. If it is the consequences of your actions, they're very much in favor of, tying responsibility for an event down to the person who caused the event. So in order for that to work, rigorously at least, they must be able to partition all of causality into the consequences of varying agents' actions. And you can't actually do that. It doesn't make any sense, not with any rigorous definition of causality, because, well, it depends how we define causality, but no matter, the only way to really define it rigorously within time is to say that, for a given moment in time, t0 minus some infinitesimal period of time, the event that took place just before t0 caused the event that took place immediately after t0. And as a result, caused all of the events that followed. So, as well as everything that affected other people and everything that affected other things. So, if you have a particle in a vacuum just flying through space or whatever, what it does, right before time t0 can be said to cause what it does immediately after t0. So if it's moving, then it's going to keep moving. If there's a force acting on it, it's going to accelerate. If it's standing still, then it's just going to keep standing still. It doesn't really make much of a difference if the particle's alone in a vacuum. It doesn't affect anything, but you can say that there are consequences to its actions. Because it does act, it does do things, and there are consequences because time is moving forward. Now let's imagine you have two particles in a vacuum, and one is stationary, and another is moving towards it right before t0. In an infinitesimal instance before t0, one thing is moving towards the other. This thing is stationary. And then, right following t0, they collide, and this particle, let's call it m1, this is m2. M2 transfers some momentum to M1, law of conservation of momentum, they bounce off of each other and go in separate directions with some weird vector over here and over there, right? So that's what happens, and what happens to the consequences of their actions, right? What are their actions? Well, the actions of M1 was that it was just sitting here. M2 was traveling at some speed, finite speed. It was not accelerating. At t0, or immediately following t0, they collided. And so now, the consequences of M1's actions is that M2 flew away, and that M1 went this way. The consequences of M2's actions are that the consequences of M2's actions are that M1 went this way, M2 went that way. The consequences of M1's actions are that M1 went that way and M2 went this way. The point is, once they interact, there's no way to differentiate causally which one of them caused the interaction. Because that's not how interactions work. Interactions are always mutual things within physics. There's always some sort of particle being exchanged. There's always... it's a shared experience, pretty much. Right? So then if M2... I mean, you could be a brat and say that, well, because M1 was stationary, M2 caused M1... That's stupid, though. I mean, stationary is not doing nothing. It's stationary. That's a specific state. And if it moves off and collides with a whole bunch of other particles, all of those collisions technically are the result of the actions of M1. Because if M2 was not traveling at that initial velocity and didn't make that collision to begin with, none of these other collisions would have happened. And if M2 bounces off and hits a bunch of particles, then all of those interactions are also the consequence of M1. Because if M1 hadn't been there, all of this stuff wouldn't have happened. So the point is, as soon as you have an interaction, the two things are causally linked from t equals 0 to infinity. They're going to be causally linked forever. And you can no longer split up the causalities and say, this is one of their actions, this is another one of their actions. That's not going to work. They've interacted, and now they're infinitely bound as far as causality is concerned. Otherwise, you'll just run into weird contradictions, like how exactly does M2 cause all of this stuff, but doesn't cause the other interactions it has on this side, right? In order to not run into something like that, you necessarily need to say that... I mean, it just doesn't make any sense otherwise, right? It doesn't make sense to say that M1 or M2 didn't cause any of this when M2 was the thing that collided with M1 to begin with, right? If every event can be tied down to an initial event, then that initial event can be said to have caused all the following events. That is how causality works, and because it's so pervasive, and because an interaction is a shared experience and both things need to be there, you pretty much can't differentiate. Now, this is of course particles, but the analogy follows through with humans. Humans are just collections of particles that are much more elaborate. The laws of physics don't change when we go up to a macroscopic level. Everything's the same. It's just way more intricate, and there's way more interactions in place. But the more interactions just doesn't change the fact that every single interaction causally binds whatever is happening in that interaction, causally binds the two different things that are interacting. And this happens, and given how many interactions there are between humans, we're causally bound in pretty severe ways. So you can't just... there's no way, there's no possible logical way to rigorously differentiate between the consequences of my actions and the consequences of your actions. We are always bound. We're interacting right now, and the consequences of my actions are the thoughts that you're having right now. Like, this whole thing is just... thrown, like, the whole property rights aggression nonsense. It all falls apart once you start considering causality and how interactions affect that stuff. Basically, the property rights pillar, what it tries to do is it tries to set up society. If I could use another analogy from physics, it tries to set up society like a heat bath with, say, 1 million particles, but every single particle is isolated in its own little box. And it has to be isolated in its box because that's that particle's property, so to speak. They don't interact. They don't interact because they stick to their boxes. And it's saying that, you know, that you could look at all of reality, all of society, as just 1 million particles in a heat bath isolated in their own boxes. Of course, that is clearly bullshit, because that's not how things actually work. Real world is what happens when you actually remove the boxes and the particles start bouncing off each other and colliding. And once that starts happening, any one particle's movement is causally linked to every other particle's movement. And so, causally speaking, every single particle's actions is related to every other particle's actions. You can no longer say that you have M1 and you have M2, and that's M1's actions, and those are the consequences of M2's actions. You can't do that. They would like us to believe, the capitalists would like us to believe, that you can take the heat bath, where all the particles are divvied up into boxes, and say that just by looking at how... Actually, no, that's the economic side of this. But the point is, yeah, this is how it is. And this isn't a matter of refining the partition or whatever. There's no way to partition this, is my point. It's just because of how causality is defined. Like, what are you going to partition? The domain or the range? That's just going to give you a set of points. The only thing that's static in this case is the actual law of physics that allows these things to interact. And the laws of physics are all temporal. And as far as time is concerned, there's only one way to look at causality, right? There's only one way to view cause and effect, which is one event caused all the following events. And if one event involves two particles interacting, then everything that the other particle does from now until infinity will be the result, the consequential result of this interaction, as well as everything that the first particle does. And with that, you can no longer say that you can somehow differentiate the consequences. It doesn't make any sense. Because if you could differentiate the consequences, you could look back at any one event and say that in that interaction, that interaction was the consequences of just one of the particle's actions, which makes no sense because clearly the other one has to be there to interact with the other. It's a paradox this way that just doesn't make any sense. This is amongst all the other things you could say about the whole non-aggression principle pillar. The other pillar is the whole free market pillar, and the free market pillar, or the market pillar, I try not to even use the word free because to me this is all just about whether or not capitalism is good, not whether or not freedom is a thing. That's the less relevant point. This pillar revolves around economic theory, microeconomic theory and macroeconomic theory, and suffice it to say, but my economic theory is basically entirely bullshit, at least the way it's taught in universities for the most part. It's not a good theory. It doesn't capture reality well, at least microeconomic theory. It's based on assumptions that are completely absurd. It entirely misunderstands human nature. The assumptions are so ridiculous that the domain of where the economic toolset applies might not even exist in reality at all. It's rife with mathematical errors and inconsistencies and proofs by contradiction and things where they pretend that an infinitesimally small quantity is the same thing as zero and stuff like that, and it's not testable, and nothing in there is testable. Very little of microeconomic theory is actually testable. The one thing you can test is the macroeconomy and the assumptions. And it just so happens that we have tested the assumptions of economic theory, and they're not valid. Next of all is the only thing you have in terms of testing is econometrics, but the problem with econometrics is that econometrics assumes that, econometrics usually operates with observable data rather than controlled experiments, right? And the problem there is that for the theory to be valid, you have to test it in controlled experiments because that's the only way to make sure that we've isolated the right variables and can prove causation rather than correlation. When you're stuck with observable data, you just get correlation effects, and you don't know if there's actual causal factors. And this is a huge problem. So really, the theory is incredibly problematic. And honestly, it's entirely unintuitive once you get down to it, at least to me, as far as its assumptions go, as far as what it says about reality, as far as it says about how the economy is always in equilibrium, how the economy is, you can look at it through comparative statics and all this stuff. So economic theory is something I basically completely reject, for the most part. There's a lot of heterodox economists that are trying to come up with alternative theories which are more promising. Nothing is conclusive. Nothing is complete. Right now, it's like the geocentrists before the Copernican revolution. It's basically a complete mess. And my default attitude is that I don't trust it by itself. Now, that would sort of debunk any neoclassical, neo-Keynesian argument for economics, but the only thing left at that point would be the Austrian argument. And the only other argument the Austrians have, because they reject all the math and all that equilibrium crap as well, is that the economy is an evolutionary system that helps us evolve. And this is the final part of that pillar. And this argument is also wrong. Rather, this faith is also wrong. Speaking of which, the whole economics thing is very much like that whole heat bath example, where they're saying that by looking at how the individual million particles bounce around inside their own boxes is somehow a good model for what's going to happen in the heat bath once you get rid of the boxes and the particles start hitting each other. And that's not true. It's not true in thermodynamics. There's no reason to think it would be true for the economy as a whole. Moreover, the conditions to test microeconomic theory don't even exist, because you can't ever take an individual and isolate them in a box like you can a thermodynamic particle. But anyway, the evolutionary argument. This is the only other pillar that exists. And so this one is a bit confusing. But it boils down to the idea that the capitalist economy is somehow an evolutionary system, or it's something that either helps evolution go along, or it's very much in favor of evolution, or something like that. It's wrong. And part of the reason why it's wrong is because what it's doing is it's necessarily expanding the definition of evolution as something that doesn't just apply to genetic mutation. It's something that applies to a lot more than that. They're expanding the definition. It applies to culture, it applies to society, it applies to ideas, it applies to memes. It might even apply to chemicals and particles and physics. It might apply to just everything. It's like the universe as a whole intends for something to happen. It's like it's selecting for something specific, which is a compelling idea. But the problem is, if you're going to assume that, then everything that already exists must necessarily be part of that evolutionary path, which necessarily must include everything human beings have built, which must include the government, and the government programs, and all of that stuff. So you cannot make the argument that the government is a non-evolutionary system, or that it's something that's keeping our evolution back, because that's a hard case to make. That assumes you know exactly what evolution is intending. And if you expanded the definition of evolution to include almost everything, there's no way you could possibly know what evolution is intending or what it's selecting for, because now it's just way too general, right? You would have to know specifically what it's intending for in order to make the case that government is anti-evolutionary or something. I have to make a small segue here and explain sort of the way to look at this is you have to know what a means is and what an ends. Like, do the ends justify the means type of a question. So what is a means and what is an end? What is an end? A means is something that is temporary, that is supposed to get you to an end. And an end is something that is supposed to be permanent and stay there forever, basically. Until we find a better end, I suppose. Right? But an end is the actual intent, the point you're trying to get to. And a means is just a way to get there. So, for example, if my intention is to establish a government, and I succeed in doing that, then the government is an end. However, if I seek to establish a government, and I intend for it to collapse a year later, then establishing the government is not my end, it is my means. My end was the disestablishment and the fall of the government a year later. If I don't intend for it to happen, that's just a mistake. But the point is, the means and end describe our intention. So if you're a capitalist and you're talking about the ends of evolution, then, if you're talking about capitalism as the means of evolution, then that must mean that you have an end in mind, right? It must mean that you understand evolution sufficiently well that you have an end in mind, right? It's not something that follows directly from the definition of evolution. See, every time we make a prescriptive statement, we always have an end in mind, even if we're just describing genetic evolution, right? Even if we're just describing, so a system where rabbits are, they're copulating a lot, and so they're populating quickly, and they're going through all sorts of genetic mutations very quickly. One might look at that and say, well, evolution's happening a lot quicker in that situation, right? Sure, but that's assuming the definition, which is that evolution is intending for the genetic mutations to happen more quickly, and that it's intending specifically for the genetic evolution of this species. But if we're expanding the definition of evolution to include memes, then evolution doesn't necessarily intend for the selfish propagation of one's genes. Evolution could intend for anything. It could intend for altruism. It could intend for communism. It could intend for any ideology, right? Because we've just expanded the definition to include almost anything. So at this point, you can't make the argument that that capitalism is just a means for evolution to happen quickly, because that assumes you know specifically what the ends are, that you have understood evolution enough to know exactly what the ends are. And there's no way you could know that. Just like in the genetic example, we assume that we know that all evolution is doing is it's trying to get the organism to adapt its genes. But if we expand the definition and evolution is doing more than that, maybe it's headed for some sort of static way of organizing society, then you can no longer argue for capitalism as a means, because then you don't know whether evolution is happening quickly or slowly, because you don't know what it's intending, right? If evolution, the speed at which it's working, it can only be sort of intuitively gauged if we know what it's trying to get to. If we know what evolution is driving at, we know how fast it's trying to get there. But if we have no idea what it's trying to get to, then we have no way of telling how fast it's going. And we have no way of, and if we expand the definition of evolution, we have no idea what it's trying to get to, what it's selecting for specifically. And hence we have no idea to tell specifically how fast it's going. It could be going just as fast in an authoritarian government system as it is in a capitalist one. Capitalism does change, and there are things that happen, but again, we don't know what evolution is actually trying to get us to build. Like, it could be trying to make our entire species go extinct. It could just be selecting for the heat death of the universe. After all, that's what's likely to happen anyway, with this whole dark energy thing as well. Like, we have zero idea of what evolution is driving at. We have no way of knowing whether it's going there faster or quickly under any given social system. So the argument that capitalism, the Austrian economist argument that capitalism is necessarily an evolutionary system, whereas the government is not, is a fallacy, because it assumes we know what evolution is trying to get to, and that the innovation that entrepreneurs have in a capitalist system is somehow what evolution is selecting for. And since you have just expanded the definition of evolution to include everything just by going into this, you can no longer make that case. Not so easily, at least, because evolution might not actually be interested in, for instance, having the entrepreneurs innovate. Maybe there's a certain amount of innovation that evolution is selecting for specifically. Maybe there's a certain static thing that it's trying to select for. See, you don't know. That's the thing. And so you can't make that argument. The only argument you can make at this point is an argument for the end. That anarcho-capitalism is somehow the intended end, or that a capitalist system is the end that evolution is selecting for, not the means. Or that you know sufficiently enough about the end, and that the end will look similar enough to a capitalist system that evolution is necessarily selecting for that. Oh, by the way, there's even more problems with looking for evolution as a means. Again, if you don't know the end, you don't know what the means should be to get to the end, is basically the argument there. But yeah, if it is the end, then you run into a whole bunch of other problems. Like, you don't know, like, if anarcho-capitalism is the end, right off the bat, you don't necessarily know that you will achieve this end by trying to deregulate and trying to establish a market. At least because there could be other hidden variables that might make that whole process bounce back. If you try to establish a free market and get rid of a government, you don't know if that's stable right off the bat. It could be that just by trying to dismantle the government, it might work temporarily, but what will happen almost immediately after that is it reestablishes itself like a parasite, even stronger than it was before. It could be that you can't get rid of it at all, that it's a complete state of disequilibrium. Right, as far as a social system. It could be that things tend completely away from this point of anarcho-capitalism. So just arguing that anarcho-capitalism is somehow the intended end is basically impossible. And libertarians have never, almost never do this. People always ask them, so what is this utopia, this capitalist utopia you're trying to build? And they always run into problems because they're describing it like they're trying to describe that heat bath by looking at just a box with a particle in it. You know, rather than talking about the whole system when you get rid of the boxes. Because that's a whole fallacy. But yeah, what they're doing is they're looking at a piece of it and trying to describe the piece, but they can't describe the system as a whole because the system as a whole doesn't make any sense. The system as a whole is an incoherent concept, right? That's what I would say. That's why I say anarcho-capitalism can't even be the intended end. At least that's part of the reason. But the point is, if we're going to have the discussion of capitalism as a social system, we can only have the discussion if we know, the only framing of this discussion could be that capitalism is the intended end for society as a social system. But that's never how the discussion's actually turning. That's not how it's actually happening, but that's how it has to happen. This is the case that the capitalist has to make. This is the only case they can make, because all the other elements of this thing don't make any sense. They can't be making the case that it's just a means to an end. They have to make the case that it is the end, but they can't make that case. Because to make that case, they need to look specifically at the capitalist system without a government and try to construct it explicitly. You know, with their judgment. And doing this you will always run into logical errors if you do this. Simply because of the existence of public goods and interactivity and all that stuff I mentioned, and how you can't separate people, how you can't look at the heat bath and look at how it interacts, look at how the heat bath works by isolating all of the particles in the heat bath into boxes. People don't belong in boxes, damn it. But there's an even sort of, like, the whole perspective here, it's kind of like the argument that I'm sure many of you have heard. A person might occasionally say, I'm not going to vote because my vote won't make a difference. It's kind of like that argument, right? Now, that argument is incredibly problematic. It might be true if the election is in, say, a week, and the candidate you want to win is down by 90% of the polls. Yes, then your vote probably won't make a difference. But you cannot state this to be true in general, right? In general, this isn't true, right? In general, it's not true, and some of you might see why it's not true in general due to just common sense, but it's even deeper than common sense. It follows from aspects of information theory and chaos theory, which sound like very complicated, daunting words, but they're actually not, and they're perfectly in line with common sense. The basic principle is, your vote won't make a difference if you know for sure, for 100% certainty, what every other agent is going to do, right, from now until infinity. That is the condition required for your statement that your vote won't make a difference in general from t0 to infinity, for that statement to be true. For that statement to be true, you must know how all of the agents, what every single agent is going to do from now until infinity. And of course that's nonsense, because there's no way you could possibly know what all the other people are going to do. Some people might change their minds. Some of them might change their minds because of you, right? So there's no way you could possibly know what all of them are going to do, you know, regardless of what your actions are, you know, for an infinite time horizon, right? And this is where information and chaos theory come into effect. Information theory basically says that there's no such thing as a system with perfect information. But it says even more than that, but it says that there's actually an upper bound as to how much information you can have in a system, how much information a computer, a machine, can be aware of. And the upper bound is it basically follows like this, but in order to perfectly understand every interaction within a given system, you need a machine that is itself larger than that system. The machine that would be required to compute all the interactions within a given system X would necessarily have to be like 1 billion times bigger than X. Like it would have to include many, many more particles than X itself. In other words, a system can never be fully aware of itself. That's just impossible with information theory. And this makes perfect intuitive sense. Like, for example, if I were to explain what a bit of data was to you through text, that would necessarily take more than a bit of data. And if I was to try and write down, what every atom in the universe was doing on paper, that would necessarily require more atoms than are in the universe, because just to write down what one atom is doing, I need a certain amount of paper and ink, which necessarily must include multiple atoms. So it's just absurd. You get into these kinds of absurdities of like infinite information. The point is, it's impossible for any agent to know exactly what all the agents are going to do from now for an infinite time horizon. And this uncertainty necessarily changes how we look at this problem. You can't be certain about not changing other people's perspectives for an infinite time horizon, only forward to, say, some small amount of time. And this is where chaos theory comes into effect. And chaos theory, unlike information theory, just says how severe the uncertainty actually is. And the uncertainty, and it basically says that the uncertainty is so severe that our computational power would have to start going up exponentially just to get a little bit more precise the further we go into the future. Like, the amount of computational power it grows exponentially to infinity to figure out how the different paths diverge, if we go a further second past a certain time. The point is, once you have nonlinear relationships between the things in reality, it becomes a computational nightmare. It literally becomes impossible to see what's going to happen past a certain barrier. And this computational barrier and it's not that it stops being deterministic. It doesn't stop it being deterministic. It stops being predictable because it's that complicated. But it doesn't obey the laws of randomness either. It doesn't become probabilistic. It's still entirely unique, and it's still entirely deterministic. It just stops being predictable because it's that complex. Which means we're always in a state of complete uncertainty. And given that we're always in a state of complete uncertainty, the whole capitalist argument of evolution as a means makes absolutely no sense. Because if you have no idea what end evolution is selecting for, if you are necessarily in a state of complete uncertainty about that, so your actions today, as far as establishing a social system, might be completely off base. You might be going completely in the other direction. You have no idea. You can't possibly know because of information and chaos theory. Because of information and chaos theory, you can't possibly know the ends. At least just by looking at evolution as a mechanism. You can't possibly know the ends by looking at what evolution is doing, because it's too complicated. That's why the whole Austrian argument for how evolution is a means that operates through a capitalist system is invalid. Because it suggests that just by knowing how evolution works, they know what's going to happen to an infinite time horizon. Or they know enough to know what's going to happen. But they can't. They're in a state of complete uncertainty about what evolution is selecting for, thanks to chaos theory and information theory. And as a result, they have no idea what evolution could possibly be selecting for. Them advocating for a capitalist system might be the opposite of what evolution is selecting for. They have no way to know, basically. And with all of this in mind, the capitalist religion crumbles. But of course the discussion never gets to this, because it always gets bogged down in definitions, and it always gets bogged down in random BS, and why don't you make the case for government? And they always jump to that. Make the case for government. I don't have to. I mean, I have already just made the case. Well, I sort of do, because I do have to make the case that capitalism is problematic somehow. But the point is, and the point with this chaos theory, information theory bit, is that any case for or against capitalism must be made within a state of uncertainty. Must be made with a case where we don't know exactly what evolution is selecting for. Neither party can assume that just by understanding the mechanisms of evolution today, you have a framing for what it's selecting for. No, what we know about physics and information theory suggests necessarily that even by understanding the mechanisms of evolution today, we still have no idea what it's selecting for. And as a result, we're in a state of complete uncertainty, and as a result of that, we have to make a decision based on some kind of emotional heuristic what evolution might be selecting for. That is the only option remaining to us. That is the general framing of this problem. I hope you enjoyed. Sorry for taking longer. I should have been shorter than that. Anyway, cheers! And yeah.